Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about something that is definitely in the news right now, and that is the idea of presidential funerals. And Chris, if you get elected president, if we have a President Chris one day, one of the first things you're going to be asked to do when you step into the White House is to start, excuse me, to start planning your funeral. Presidents plan their own funeral down to the detail. They plan their funeral. So, Chris, if you ever get elected, I want to be at the table when they sit down and say, we need to plan your funeral because we're going to have to look at the history of presidential funerals to decide how you want yours done.
Hey, yeah, appreciate that you're already wishing that upon
No.
me. uh, I do think it is interesting though because many people do think it's morbid and they don't really think through it. But one of the things that the president has the opportunity to do by being able to plan or to participate in the planning of their funeral is it helps to create a final goodbye, if you will, to the nation. They are, the symbol of democracy, if you will, and so it is this opportunity for them to illustrate something about the person, about their legacy, their character, and it's on this national stage in a very somber, intimate, but very real way. And Ray, I would say that it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on, that when a president does pass away, that one of the things that everybody does is they stop and they pay attention to that moment. And there's been how many? I think, will this be the fifth one? I think, is that right? Or sixth one? I can't remember that have taken place.
The sixth,
Where the
the
sixth
sixth
one?
funeral since we've been alive. Yeah, the sixth.
Okay, so the sixth one, and that doesn't include Nixon, right?
That does include Nixon.
All right, because it, I think when you think about this, Nixon, he's kind of one of those anomalies since he technically resigned from office, but there's a lot of splendor and formality, but also it's very much planned to the minute as to what happens, and it's very, if you're a history nerd like us, you find some great interest in the orchestration of it and how it all comes about.
Yeah, and the planning, like you said, goes right down to the detail. Of course, we're recording this episode right after the death of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. He was the 76th governor of the state of Georgia, served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. He, of course, passed away recently at the age, Chris, of 100. We're halfway there. He
Yes.
he passed away at the age of 100. He is going to have a state funeral. Just a little bit for our listeners who may listen to it before this episode before the funeral. It's going to begin in Georgia at the Carter Center on January 4, where he will lie in state until January 7. Then he will be transferred to the U.S. Capitol there in Washington, D.C., where he will lie in state, I believe, in the Capitol Rotunda from the 7th to the 9th of January. And then on the 9th, his body will leave the Capitol, head back down to Plains, Georgia for a funeral at Maranatha Baptist Church and a private internment service. So everything's going to go really fast here, starting January 4, which I believe is a Saturday, running through January 9th, which is a Thursday. And we're going to see this whole state funeral thing where you're going to hear every time every time the casket goes in or out of a building or a car, Hail to the Chief is going to play. You're going to have cannons firing. This is going to be a big production over the next few days. And Chris, this is a very interesting time, January 2025, for Washington, D.C. to have to be managing a presidential funeral because they've also managing January 6th, the certification of the 2024 election, and of course, then the inauguration on January 20th. So this is if you're in Washington, D.C., this is going to be a very busy month.
It is a busy month, and I go back to the idea of just these funerals, 5 days in length, where pretty much the president has declared, I think, the actual day, January 9th, of the service in Washington to be like a federal holiday, where it just shows the enormity of this happening. And I like the fact I was reading that President Carter is going to be taking a motorcade, through his hometown, and
Yeah.
they're going to stop at his boyhood home, and
Mhm.
then they're going to ring a bell for like 39 times, signaling how many times that he was the 39th president. Then go, of course, to the Georgia State Capitol, and then to the Carter Presidential Center, which is one of the things that every president basically, it's a presidential center which houses their records. And I know the one at Reagan has the replica of his Air Force One that people go through. And so it's just a powerful moment where people can pour out tributes. And, let's be honest, it wasn't very long ago we talked about President Ford, who had a state funeral
Yep.
also.
Yep.
Ford and Carter were not very well recognized as far as presidents. You hear a lot on the news today. The humanity side of Carter was phenomenal, loving, generous, cared for everyone, and would do anything for anybody. And people respect that of his humanitarian side. But then you have a lot of people who will look at his presidential role and basically say, well, how did this small town peanut farmer kid, wind his way to the White House, and what were the results of it? That the White House was too big of a stage for him. But yet, he was the 39th president of the United States, and the nation mourns, and the nation grieves, and the nation will participate. All the soap operas will not air because it will be news dedicated to President Carter, a holiday, all of these things. And I think that is so important, even then, where the president lies in state, both in Georgia, but also in Washington, where people have the opportunity to come by and to pay respects. And it goes back to the olden days of Lincoln, and just the enormous outpouring of love and support that individuals had towards the president, and being able to say thank you, Mr. President.
And you mentioned the olden days. I mean, I think it's proper here to go back to the first presidential funeral, which was held on December 18, 1799. I'll give you three guesses who that president was.
And what year was it?
1799.
Well, I'm sure there would only be one person that you would be speaking of, and that would be Father George.
Yes, yes. So George Washington, of course, he passes away rather rapidly on December 14, 1799. I'm sure it wasn't rapid to the people around him, or even to him as he suffered for those last hours. But he dies on December 14, 1799. And they wait 4 days, Chris. And the reason they wait 4 days is Washington had a fear that today I think most people don't have a fear because of medical technology and embalming and all this stuff, but he had a fear of being buried alive. So he wanted to make sure that, before you put me in that tomb, they weren't going to bury him, but before you put me in that tomb, make sure I'm actually dead. So they waited 4 days, from December 14 to December 18, 1799, before they held a funeral. It was a huge funeral. Lots of people showed up, people wearing black in mourning, the whole 9 yards. But you know who did not attend George Washington's funeral other than,
Was
well,
it his wife?
yeah, Martha Washington stayed up at the house. She was too distraught to actually go down to the tomb, to visit the tomb. But they laid him there in a I guess you'd call it a casket or a coffin in the old tomb there at Mount Vernon. He already had plans in place for this new brick tomb, which they built. And Chris, in 1831, they came back and moved him. And just like, yeah, and I read this and I was like, that sounds like something I would have to do. They opened the casket just to see what he looked like. I mean, just to get a glimpse of the general, the old president. And they said he was in remarkably, and this was He died in 1799 and this was 1831. So what, 32 years later? And they said he was still, his uniform was still there, is said you could still tell who it was. And Chris is making all sorts of faces as I describe.
Well, I do because I'm thinking first of all, the process of burying someone at that time was very.
Right.
I mean, was not as advanced scientific as it is today, you would
Right.
think. And so I could just imagine opening up that coffin and, regardless of the looks, but just the smell and just
Yep.
the, I don't know if embalming and all was something that was going on or how, but I just find it remarkable that he was still
Recognize.
recognizable,
Yeah.
but, and I think if you go back to looking at these presidential funerals, and we talk about the rhythm that there is a specific point to everything. But if I'm not mistaken, that President Carter will be laid, as you mentioned, in the rotunda,
Hmm.
and they put him on and I cannot say the name of it, a calf, it's something.
How about what they
Uh,
put the casket on?
yes, you remember what it's called?
Let me find out. Hang on.
It's called something, but I believe it's the same one that goes all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. I think just the history of it that they that this whole process is so orchestrated that it even goes back to the time catafalque. I think that's the name of it,
I
catafalque.
can't find it. Uh,
Yeah, it's a wooden thing that holds the casket, and it was called the Lincoln catafalque, and I believe that is still used even today. They still do the caissons where they would have the horse that would march the casket. I think Kennedy did that when he went to
hmm,
be buried at
yep.
the, um,
Arlington.
Arlington. So I mean, just this idea and Ray, it maybe and might be getting off subject here, and bring me back if I need to, but I'm thinking about the political divisiveness of where we are right now. And many people expected Jimmy Carter wouldn't last very long after his wife died. They were married for
Yep.
70 some years, I think.
Did she die last? Was it last year?
Yes. And but they were amazed at how long he held on.
Hmm.
And I just wonder, and then that it's January the 9th, as you said, so much going on in Washington, so much just issues. Jimmy Carter was a very faithful religious man, one of the most religious presidents I would dare say
Yep.
that has been in that particular office. And isn't it just ironic, a coincidence that on January the 9th, you will be having a service for a former president who, above all, said, "Love one another as I have loved." That maybe that's exactly what this nation needs as the income. You have the person who lost the election having to certify the election results of the one who won the election. They hate each other.
Hmm.
And then in a few weeks, that person who 70 million Americans do not like will watch him being sworn into office. You just have to wonder, here is a state funeral of a president who wasn't the best president in the world, but you could make a strong case, one of the kindest men in the whole world.
Oh, one of the kindest men and one of the best men who ever taken the oath of office to be president of the United States. I think that's for certain. Because when you think of politicians at that level, Chris, especially today, you don't think of, you know, very nice people. You don't think of, what kind of person in the late 20th into the 21st century gets up one morning, looks in the mirror and says, you know what this country and this world needs? Me.
Mm.
That takes a level of ego that I think most people just don't have. And I think that's one of the reasons that I like some of the older presidents, whether you're talking about, into the 20th century, William Howard Taft, or even going back to George Washington. A lot of these people, I'm not saying they didn't want to be president, but they didn't pursue it like people do today. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's another opportunity. Very rarely do you see all living presidents get together.
Yeah.
And so usually these type of events, all presidents, and I assume, I haven't heard who's all attending, but I'm pretty confident that all the remaining living presidents will attend this service. So then you have just that dynamic as well. Um, Also, I do think that we have to keep in mind, because of the political divisiveness and everything that's going on, the temperature in the United States is on edge. And so you have all of these politicians, all of these, it's a huge event taking place in Washington. There's been some security issues,
Yep.
some devastating events taking place in our country during the recording of this podcast. And so, you know, you are living now in a different state. I saw somewhere where 100,000 people went through the U.S. Capitol to visit Ronald Reagan's body as it lies in state.
Yep.
I don't know how many will come for President Carter, but what I do know is that you have to nowadays, unfortunately, think about security and think
Yep.
about all of these other things that are going on, because the Capitol is the center of democracy. And you now are opening up your doors to all people to come and pay respects. And so, just a lot that this presidential funeral will bring to our nation. But one of the things I hope it brings is true healing, and also hope that it can be okay.
Yeah, things can be better than what we have them right now. One of the things, and this is going to something you said, how many people will show up? One of the things that I became aware of recently when we talk about Jimmy Carter's passing is how many people alive today have no memory of Jimmy Carter. Now, you and I probably don't. I don't have memory of Jimmy Carter as president. I was alive when Jimmy Carter was president, but I was, and you were in the same situation. I was, you know, just a wee little kid. Do you have any memories of him?
Very little,
I don't have
very
any.
little.
I don't have any. The first president I'm really aware of, um, might be Ronald Reagan, but definitely the first one I ever really paid attention to was George Bush. But how so many people living today were not alive or not old enough to remember Carter, much of Carter being president. But you were talking about the living presidents. There's five living presidents now: George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. And I know Biden will be there because he's doing a eulogy, I believe. Donald Trump said he's going to be there. I assume Bush, Clinton, and Obama will be there as well. But when I look at that list, Chris, talking about age, Bush, Clinton, and Trump and Biden are all about the same age. Obama's the youngest one in the group.
Wow.
There's a commentary in there somewhere. I hadn't, I hadn't figured it out yet, though.
And there is, and like I said, just the dynamics of that, and just bringing people together. It is remarkable that a man from Plains, Georgia,
Yep.
will bring all of these people together in the nation's capital to observe, his role. I mean, he did achieve the unthinkable. He became president of the United States, and during difficult times, he comes, after Ford, he comes with the situation going on with Iran, and I mean, just a lot of things going on, and yeah, I just the symbolism and the beauty
Yep.
of these events. It's kind of like the inauguration. When we talk about the inauguration is very timed and themed and scripted.
Mhm.
And that's another interesting, I guess, what you would call a government event. And
Yep.
so um, the world should always pay attention to these funerals because of the words that are spoken, but also the hope that it brings by the nation coming together.
Yeah, Carter, just going back to Carter, one of the things that struck me as you were talking there, you were talking about how he was president in difficult times. I think Jimmy Carter's sort of in my mind, sometimes is sort of the poster child for the, how sometimes powerless presidents are in the face of what's going on around the nation. He tried so hard, he tried so many different things, and it just didn't work, whether it was the economy, whether it was the Iranian hostage situation, whatever it was. He tried so many things and so many things didn't work, just proving, I think, over and over again that presidents a lot of times are victims or um, they're either victims or they're fortunate from things that happen to them and not things that they themselves do. Just go ahead.
No, I was going to agree with you. I like the phrase that you're talking about, that they, the victims.
Yeah.
That's something that is not really discussed as much,
Yeah.
is that aspect that comes upon them.
Yeah. And just a few more. We're running out of time. Got just about 9 minutes to go here. So just run through a few things. The first sitting president to die, of course, I know Mr. Chris knows this. April 4, 1841 was William Henry Harrison. It used to be said, and I used to have a fun time teaching American History 1, and we would talk about him, and I'd say he gave this long inaugural address in the cold rain and all that, which is all true. And then I said, and he died his death of cold. And a few years ago, there was some research that came out, I think it was 17 or something, for some medical story, and said, no, he likely died of cholera. But anyway, he died. He was the first president to die, of course, a sitting president to die. At his funeral, it was held in the East Room there in the White House. It was by invitation only. You had to be an important person to get in there, and the U.S. Marine Band played. So there's that. And also, just one other thing I'm pointing out, Chris, is this is one of my favorite little, well, two more things. My favorite little tidbits is that John F. Kennedy and William Howard Taft are the only presidents buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And I have not had the opportunity to go to Arlington. I know you have. But if I ever get to Arlington, Taft's going to be the grave I'm going to visit. I might get to Kennedy if I can, but Taft will be the one I'm going to visit. And then, of course, John Tyler, because of his position during the Civil War, his funeral was not recognized by the U.S. Congress, by government. So, um, you know, and Richard Nixon, by the way, did not have a state funeral. That was a private funeral. So, but yeah,
And Harrison's wife didn't attend his funeral either.
she
She
didn't.
was sick also.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
it's something. And I'm looking at the list, people who have died in our lifetime or right before our lifetime. Lyndon Johnson, 1973, Richard Nixon, 1994, Ronald Reagan, 2004, Gerald Ford, I remember that one very well, 2006. George Bush, 2018. He was right behind, as far as age is concerned, he was right behind Carter, wasn't he? Like age.
yes, so 5 years. It's been 5 years.
Yeah. And then Jimmy Carter. So, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff, and we just scratched the surface.
Hey, I thought it was a great selection, because not only is it timely, but also it's one of those things that everybody will hear about, everybody will see, but maybe not everybody understands the history behind it. And it's really history you should know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can find us, as always, on Spotify or YouTube. We ask that you like this episode on either platform, share this episode with your family and friends, and get the word out about history you didn't know but should. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
I'll talk to you later.